My mom picked me up from practice every day for 2 years and never noticed I was wearing the same bruised uniform. Coach Brennan only wanted to break one player on the team. Me, not the other girls who got water breaks and encouragement. Just me, the goalie who took up too much space in his perfect vision of what a winning team should look like. When I was 14, we were all changing after practice when my teammate Zoe asked, "Why does Mia have those marks on her uniform?" Before I could speak, I felt Coach's hand clamp down on my shoulder through the locker room doorway. She fell during drills. Happens when you're not paying attention, right, Mia? My mom honked from the parking lot, impatient. And from there, Coach got strategic. My mom's nursing shifts meant practice time was his territory. By the time I turned 15, the routine was carved in stone. Every practice at 4:30 p.m., while the other girls ran warm-up laps, Coach would make me stay in the goal for shooting drills that never ended. 23 shots blocked today, he'd announce, his voice tight with disappointment. That's 3 less than yesterday. Extra conditioning after everyone leaves. But Coach, I have homework. I was cut off by the sound of him blowing his whistle. The other girls got their gear bags and headed out. Mine sat in his office where he'd taken it that morning for inspection. Coach, please. My mom's waiting. She can wait 5 more minutes. He tapped his watch. Unless you want to explain to her why you're not taking this sport seriously, you'll smile and wave when she pulls up like a good athlete. I never told my mom directly, but I gave signs. Is it normal to have bruises that won't heal? I asked her once while she was checking her phone before bed. Coach's laugh had been casual that afternoon when I'd mentioned my ribs hurt. You know how dramatic teenage athletes can be. They want attention for every little bump. By winter, things were falling apart in ways even Coach couldn't hide. My uniform had permanent dirt stains and what looked like blood on the chest pad from where balls had hit me at full force. And after I got caught limping between classes, my punishment was staying an extra hour while Coach fired shots at my head, teaching me to fear hesitation. Mom texted that she was running late from her shift, and Coach scrambled to have me scrub my uniform in the locker room sink to make it look cleaner from a distance. When she pulled up, she relaxed. Good. You're ready to go. That was when I stopped fighting back. I looked in the mirror one morning and didn't see the injured athlete everyone else saw. I saw what Coach had been telling me for months. Too slow, too weak, too soft for competitive soccer. You're right, I told him before practice. I'm pathetic. I don't deserve to be on this team. For the first time in 18 months, he looked uncertain. Well, maybe you just need to work on your reflexes. No, I'm too weak for this sport. You were right, Coach. You see, we both knew if I quit the team completely, questions would be asked. Parents would want explanations, and school administration might investigate. But if I stayed and got injured badly enough during a game, it would just be a tragic accident. Mom finally noticed during the championship match in May, I'd won the regional MVP award the year before, which made Coach angrier because he said I was getting attention I hadn't earned through real toughness. Standing in goal felt like waiting for execution. The opposing team's striker wound up for a penalty kick. Coach had spent the week before telling me to stay centered, don't dive, prove I could take the hit. The ball came at my face at full speed. I didn't move. Someone screamed when I dropped. Mia. Mom's voice cut through everything. She'd left her seat in the stands and was running across the field. Coach rushed over with his concerned mentor performance. She just froze up. Could be a concussion. We should get her checked out. But Coach, I said, tasting blood in my mouth, you told me not to move. You said real goalies take the hit. Mom's entire face changed as she looked from me to Coach. The last thing I heard before passing out was Zoe's voice, steady and clear for once. Coach has been keeping her after practice alone for 2 years, making her block shots until she can't stand up. My best friend had finally found her courage. I woke up in the hospital to the sound of Mom crying. Fractured cheekbone, the doctor kept saying. Severe bruising consistent with repeated impact trauma. Mrs. Reeves, your daughter has been systematically injured over an extended period. If this had been one hit harder, we'd be discussing permanent vision loss or brain damage. Coach played his last card from where the school administrator was questioning him in the hallway. She wanted the starting position so badly, she'd do anything. I've been trying to teach her discipline, but teenage girls can be self-destructive when they don't get what they want. They called my mom from the examination room that night, pending investigation. Coach's story was convincing enough that they needed to verify everything. Zoe was too scared to repeat what she'd said on the field. And as I lay in the hospital bed surrounded by CT scan machines and ice packs, I smiled because I knew what I had to do to get revenge on Coach and make it right. The beeping monitors pulled me back to consciousness the next morning. I stared at the ceiling tiles while making myself a promise that this wasn't about surviving anymore. It was about fixing everything Coach had broken. My face felt swollen and strange, like someone had replaced my skull with something twice the normal size. When the doctor came in carrying a thick folder, his expression was grim in a way that made my remaining good eye water. He sat down next to my bed and explained that my cheekbone had multiple fractures in different stages of healing, which meant this wasn't from one injury but from repeated trauma over months or years. They were documenting everything with x-rays that showed old breaks that had never been properly treated. Even though Coach was somewhere in the building being questioned, it felt like he was still controlling the narrative through his carefully constructed image as a dedicated mentor. The 4th drip felt cold going into my arm, while the doctor talked about orbital socket damage and the risk of permanent facial nerve issues. I nodded along, even though focusing on his words made my head throb. Later that afternoon, a woman with sharp features and tired eyes walked in carrying a clipboard, introducing herself as Patricia Nguyen from the school district's Title IX office. And right behind her came Coach, who immediately rushed to my bedside with what looked like genuine tears in his eyes. Coach grabbed my hand and squeezed it gently while Patricia asked me questions about what had been happening at practice. Every time I tried to explain about staying late alone, Coach would interrupt with concerned comments about how hard I'd been pushing myself and how he'd tried to get me to ease up. I tried to tell Patricia about the extra conditioning sessions and the head-level shots, but my words came out slurred from the pain medication, and Coach kept talking over me with worried observations about teenage athletes who couldn't admit when they needed help. Patricia wrote everything down, but I could see doubt in her eyes, especially when Coach started describing his years of coaching awards and testimonials from grateful parents. She seemed ready to believe his version where I was an overambitious athlete who'd injured myself through reckless determination. That evening, after Coach finally left with the administrator trailing behind him, another staff member came to tell me that practice had been temporarily suspended while they investigated both sides of the story. The guilt hit me so hard the heart monitor started beeping faster. Realizing my entire team was being punished because I hadn't been strong enough to speak up sooner, hadn't been brave enough to stop Coach before it got this bad. 3 days passed in a blur of neurological exams and medication adjustments that made everything feel distant and unreal. On the third day, I finally worked up the courage to tell my nurse about everything while she checked my bandages. She listened without interrupting while I explained the daily extra sessions that started at exactly 5:15 p.m. after everyone else left. How Coach would make me block shots until my equipment was soaked with sweat and sometimes blood from where the balls had split my lip or bloodied my nose. I told her about the time he'd locked my gear bag in his office so I couldn't leave until he decided I'd worked hard enough. The nurse wrote everything down in careful handwriting and promised to pass it along to the hospital's social work team, squeezing my uninjured shoulder gently before she left. The next morning, a pediatrician with wire-rimmed glasses came in and introduced himself as Dr. Vincent Halstead, explaining that he'd been asked to do a comprehensive examination to document any signs of long-term athletic abuse. He was methodical and professional, taking photographs of the bruising on my ribs from where balls had hit me without proper padding, the permanent marks on my shoulders from diving onto hard ground repeatedly, the way my hands showed signs of repeated impact trauma that had damaged the small bones. I could see anger building behind his clinical demeanor, even though his voice stayed measured and calm. He ordered additional imaging that would show the progression of injuries over time, and detailed blood work that could help establish a timeline for when the abuse had started. On my 4th day in the hospital, my teammate Zoe came to visit with her mom, both of them looking nervous like they weren't sure they should be there. Zoe sat on the edge of my bed and told me she'd been keeping a journal for the past year after she noticed Coach treating me differently than everyone else. She'd written down dates and times when he'd kept me late, documented the practice sessions where he'd made me block shots until I was crying, recorded the comments he'd made about me being weak and soft compared to goalies from other schools. Her eyes filled with tears when she looked at my bandaged face, and she promised to do everything she could to help prove what really happened. She'd already sent her journal to Patricia at the Title IX office and given copies to her parents' lawyer friend who specialized in educational negligence cases. 2 days later, Coach showed up at the hospital with flowers and a card signed by the whole team, performing his concerned mentor routine for any staff who might be watching. Security had to escort him out when he tried to come into my room without permission. I watched through my door's window as he argued with the nurses about his right to check on his injured athlete, his voice getting louder as they physically blocked his path. The mask slipped for just a moment when he looked directly at me, and I saw cold calculation in his eyes before the concerned expression returned. That same afternoon, a man in a wrinkled suit came to my room and introduced himself as Leonard Wu, explaining that my mom had consulted with him about potential legal action against the school district and Coach personally. He spread papers across my bedside table showing different legal strategies, what kind of evidence we'd need to gather, how civil cases against coaches were notoriously difficult because of qualified immunity and institutional protection. My head spun trying to understand the terminology while he explained that criminal charges would require proof of intentional harm rather than just negligent supervision. A week after that first interview, Patricia came back to talk to me again, this time with a district lawyer present who took notes on everything. She kept asking questions that made me want to scream, like whether I might have misunderstood Coach's training methods, or if maybe I'd been hiding injuries because I was afraid of losing my starting position. She seemed skeptical when I explained about the punishment sessions and the deliberate headshots, about being forced to block full-power kicks from 5 feet away, while the other girls got standard drills from regulation distance. I could feel my chance at justice slipping away with every carefully worded question designed to protect the district from liability. Patricia admitted that Coach had an exemplary record with dozens of parent testimonials and multiple coaching certifications, which made it hard to believe he'd deliberately harm a student-athlete. The next morning, Zoe showed up with her mom and 3 other teammates who'd all decided to come forward. They stood in my hospital room with scared expressions and shaking hands while they took turns describing what they'd witnessed over the past 2 years. Maya talked about the time Coach had screamed at me for crying after a ball broke my finger, calling me pathetic and weak in front of the whole team. Jordan described practice sessions where Coach would laugh when balls hit me in the face, saying real goalies didn't flinch from contact. Sienna shared text messages from the team group chat where Coach had told everyone to ignore my complaints about pain because athletes who couldn't handle pressure shouldn't play competitive sports. Their collective testimony was harder to dismiss than just one injured athlete making accusations, especially when they provided specific dates and witnesses to each incident. Later that week, my mom finally admitted something that made my stomach drop. She'd noticed my uniform looked permanently stained months ago, but assumed it was normal wear from intensive practice. She'd seen me limping sometimes, but believed Coach when he'd casually mentioned at a parent meeting that I was prone to exaggeration about minor soreness. She'd even questioned me once about bruises on my arms, But I'd been so conditioned by Coach's threats that I'd lied and said I'd bumped into a door. The guilt in her eyes was almost harder to watch than the injuries themselves, knowing she'd been right there and could have stopped everything if she'd just looked closer. Mom started going through her text message history with Coach, finding months of his reassuring responses whenever she'd expressed concern about my exhaustion or injuries. He'd been systematically gaslighting both of us, using his authority as a respected coach to explain away every warning sign with reasonable-sounding medical explanations and athletic training jargon. On my 8th day in the hospital, they started me on physical therapy to rebuild facial muscle control and make sure the nerve damage wasn't permanent. The therapist was gentle but honest about the long recovery ahead, explaining that my depth perception might be permanently affected and the scarring could require plastic surgery. She had me practice basic movements in front of a mirror, and seeing my face distorted and swollen made everything feel more real than any of the legal discussions. We worked for 30 minutes before I started crying from frustration and pain, and she helped me back to bed while promising we'd try again tomorrow with lower expectations. Meanwhile, Leonard was working on getting access to Coach's personnel file and any previous complaints filed against him by parents or students. He filed formal discovery requests with the school district and sent letters to the State Athletic Association asking about coaching certification reviews. 3 days later, he called to say the district was refusing to provide most of the requested information, citing employee privacy and ongoing investigation confidentiality. The stonewalling made him more convinced we had a strong case because innocent people didn't hide evidence. The next day, Maya showed up with printed screenshots from Coach's social media that nobody had thought to check before. His Facebook page was full of posts about building champions through adversity and teaching young athletes that pain was weakness leaving the body. He'd shared articles about old school coaching methods and how modern athletes were too soft compared to previous generations. One post from 6 months ago had a photo of me in goal with a caption about how real goalies didn't fear the ball. They embraced contact. The comments section was full of parents praising his dedication, but Maya had highlighted several where Coach responded that some athletes needed to be broken down before they could be built back up stronger. Leonard added all of it to our evidence file, explaining that Coach's own words about breaking down athletes would help prove intentional harm rather than negligent training. Patricia came back 2 days later with a folder full of papers from the school's athletic department. She'd gotten the practice logs showing that official team practice ended at 5 p.m. every day, but the gym had sign-out sheets showing Coach and one student staying until 6:30 or 7 p.m. 3 to 4 times per week for the past 18 months. The dates lined up perfectly with the evenings when my mom had been confused about why pickup took so long. Even Patricia seemed troubled by the pattern once she saw it documented in black and white, admitting that extra one-on-one training sessions should have been reported to the athletic director and required additional supervision. She added the logs to her investigation file and said it was helping establish a pattern of isolation, even if it wasn't the definitive proof we needed of abuse. A week into my hospital stay, the discharge planner came to explain that I couldn't go back to school while the investigation was happening. She said the district was arranging for home tutoring through their alternative education program, which meant I'd be isolated from my teammates and friends until everything was resolved. I wanted to get back to normal so badly, but I also knew I needed space from Coach and the school that had protected him. The tutoring coordinator was experienced with medical leaves but had no idea how to handle my situation, where the school itself was the source of trauma. While all this was happening, Coach started posting on social media about false accusations and how dedicated teachers and coaches were under attack from overly sensitive students and helicopter parents. He wrote long paragraphs about his decades of service and the hundreds of athletes he'd helped succeed. He posted old team photos showing smiling players holding trophies with captions about building character through discipline. The comments were split between people supporting him and parents who'd heard rumors about my hospitalization. Reading them made my chest hurt, even though I knew every word was calculated to make himself look like a victim of modern sensitivity culture. Dr. Halstead came in on day 9 with comprehensive medical findings that showed exactly how extensive my injuries were from months of systematic abuse. Multiple healed fractures in different stages, chronic soft tissue damage, signs of repeated concussion that had gone untreated. He explained each finding in terms that proved this wasn't from normal athletic training, but from deliberate repeated trauma. Seeing all those medical images and reports made everything more concrete than just my memories of painful practices. He said he'd write a detailed report for any legal proceedings that would be nearly impossible for the defense to dispute based on the objective physical evidence. That same afternoon, Leonard called to say he was subpoenaing security footage from the school's parking lot cameras. He wanted to show the pattern of my mom arriving at 5 p.m. for pickup, but me not leaving the building until 6:30 or 7 p.m., proving Coach had kept me isolated after official practice hours. He was building a timeline that would match my testimony about the extra sessions with visual proof that couldn't be explained away. The legal process was moving faster than expected because the medical evidence was so damning that even the district's lawyers were getting nervous about liability exposure. Patricia showed up at my house 3 days after I was finally discharged, while I watched from the living room window as Leonard's assistant photographed everything for our case file. She went into the school with 2 investigators carrying equipment to examine the gym and locker rooms. They stayed for almost 4 hours taking measurements and photographs. Later that afternoon, Patricia called Leonard and told him what they'd found in Coach's office behind his desk. A notebook with detailed records of my performance in the extra sessions, including notes about my pain tolerance and emotional responses to increasingly aggressive training. There were pages describing exactly how hard he could push before I'd break down crying, calculations about shot velocity and impact angles. Patricia took photos of every page and said her hands were shaking when she realized how methodically he'd been documenting his abuse while presenting it to himself as legitimate coaching strategy. The next day, Coach found out about the office search because the school had to notify him as part of due process. Within hours, he'd hired an aggressive defense lawyer who immediately went on local news claiming his client was being railroaded by an overzealous investigation. The lawyer showed Coach's awards and certifications, interviewed former players who praised his tough but effective methods, and suggested I was a troubled teen looking for attention after a legitimate sports injury. Watching the news segment made me want to throw something at the TV, seeing how easily he'd found people to defend him. But Leonard said every public statement Coach made gave us more material to use against him later, when inconsistencies emerged. The medical facility set me up with a trauma therapist named Dr. Rashida Clarkson, who had experience with athletic abuse cases. She taught me to separate factual observations from emotional reactions when describing what happened, explaining that legal proceedings required clinical precision rather than raw feeling. We practiced over and over how to tell my story without breaking down, because she said juries and judges respond better to composed testimony than visible distress. Every session we'd go through the timeline and she'd stop me whenever I started using words like scared or hurt and make me describe the concrete actions Coach had taken. It was harder than any physical therapy to control my emotions while recounting the worst experiences. Mom finally got permission to see the full medical report after signing legal documents, acknowledging we intended to pursue civil action. She sat at the kitchen table reading Dr. Halstead's findings and started sobbing so hard she couldn't breathe properly. 15 documented injuries over 18 months, chronic pain that I'd learned to hide, permanent facial scarring that would require reconstructive surgery. She kept saying she should have known, should have looked closer, should have trusted her instincts when things felt wrong. I told her Coach had been gaslighting both of us with expert precision, but the guilt in her eyes didn't fade. She'd spent 2 years driving me to and from the place where I was being systematically destroyed, making her an unknowing accomplice to my abuse. That same week, Maya called to say she'd been going through old team emails and found something disturbing. Coach had sent group messages about building mental toughness through adversity, but when you compared the language in emails that included me versus emails that didn't, the difference was stark. Messages about me specifically used phrases like break through weakness and overcome softness, while messages about other players focused on skill development and tactical improvement. Maya had highlighted every instance where Coach's language toward me was different, creating a pattern of singling me out for psychological manipulation. Leonard added it all to our evidence file, explaining that proving discriminatory treatment would strengthen our case significantly. 2 weeks after I got home, I went to a follow-up appointment where Dr. Halstead showed me comparison scans of my facial bones before and after healing. The fractures were knitting together, but left visible evidence of trauma that any medical professional could identify as repeated impact injuries. He explained that the pattern of damage matched exactly with soccer ball strikes to the face from close range, with enough force to break bones. His professional opinion was unambiguous. These injuries could only have resulted from deliberate, repeated trauma, not from normal athletic participation. He'd be willing to testify to that conclusion in any legal proceeding. Meanwhile, Leonard discovered that Coach had a history we hadn't known about. He'd been fired from a position at another school 8 years ago after multiple parents complained about his training methods, but the district had allowed him to resign quietly without documenting the reasons. That school had paid a settlement to one family, whose daughter had been injured during an unsupervised practice session. The pattern went back even further. 3 different schools in 12 years, always moving on before complaints could escalate to formal investigations. Our case was just the first time someone had fought back with enough evidence to prevent him from walking away. Leonard filed an amended complaint expanding our lawsuit to include negligent hiring and failure to properly investigate previous allegations. The school district's lawyers immediately requested a private settlement conference, which Leonard said meant they were getting scared about what a trial would reveal. 2 nights later, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. It was Jordan calling from a borrowed phone, whispering so quiet I could barely hear her. She said Coach had been showing up at practices for the JV team where her younger sister played, just watching from the parking lot, but making everyone uncomfortable. The school had only banned him from varsity facilities, but hadn't thought to restrict him from other athletic programs. My whole body went cold because I knew exactly what he was doing, looking for his next target now that I was gone. Jordan said her sister was scared but didn't know how to tell anyone without making things worse. I told her to have her parents call Leonard immediately and document every sighting with photos and timestamps. The next morning, during my session with Dr. Clarkson, I stood up too fast and the room started spinning. My balance was still affected by the facial injuries and I hit the floor hard enough to bruise my shoulder. Dr. Clarkson called Dr. Halstead, who came over from his practice to check me and lectured about pushing recovery too hard. He said the stress from the legal battle was slowing my healing, and if I didn't manage it better, I risked permanent complications. But I couldn't stop pushing now. Not with Jordan's sister potentially in danger, and Coach still free to target new victims. Patricia tried to interview some of Coach's defenders at the school the following week, but called Leonard afterwards sounding frustrated. The athletic director claimed he'd never received complaints about extra practice sessions and assumed any after-hours gym time was for voluntary individual training. The principal said Coach had exemplary performance reviews and parent satisfaction scores that never indicated problems. Other coaches described him as demanding but effective, the kind of old-school mentor who got results even if his methods seemed harsh to modern sensibilities. Everyone had their carefully prepared statements that protected the district from liability while throwing Coach under the bus just enough to claim they'd acted reasonably. Leonard met with me after those interviews to explain that the district was going to argue they had no way of knowing about the abuse because Coach had hidden it so effectively. We had medical records and witness testimony, but they'd counter with his positive track record and lack of formal complaints. He said we needed something more concrete that proved the district had been willfully blind to obvious warning signs. I was exhausted from fighting against people who should have protected me, but knew we had to keep pushing, or Coach would just move to another school and find a new victim. That night, I remembered something I'd forgotten in all the chaos. The school had issued me a medical alert form sophomore year after I'd disclosed having asthma. The nurse's office would have records of every time I'd come in with injuries or breathing problems. If we could get those records, they'd show the pattern of increasingly serious injuries that the school had documented but never investigated. Leonard filed a request for my complete health records from the school nurse, citing my right to access my own medical information. 3 days later, we got 50 pages of incident reports showing I'd visited the nurse 31 times in 18 months with various injuries, breathing difficulties, and complaints of pain. The nurse had documented every visit with descriptions of visible injuries and my explanations of how they'd occurred. Most of my explanations blamed myself for being clumsy or not paying attention during drills, but the pattern was undeniable once you saw it all together, escalating severity over time with injuries consistent with repeated athletic trauma. Even Patricia couldn't ignore the evidence once Leonard showed her the complete timeline with medical records, practice logs, and witness testimony all aligned. She finally admitted this looked like systematic abuse that the school should have caught much earlier through their mandatory reporting protocols. She was pushing her superiors to take stronger action against Coach and implement policy changes to prevent future cases. Her supervisor wanted to settle quietly and move on, which made me so angry I couldn't see straight. The system protecting institutions over kids felt completely backwards, prioritizing damage control over actual justice. But Patricia kept pushing, documenting every failure in the school's response and building a case for systemic reform. 2 days before Leonard's deadline for the district to respond to our settlement demands, we got news I'd been waiting for. The State Athletic Association had suspended Coach's certifications pending the outcome of the investigation, which meant he couldn't coach at any school in the state anymore. It wasn't criminal charges and it wasn't permanent, but it meant he couldn't access new victims while the legal process played out. I sat in my room and let myself feel relieved for the first time in weeks, knowing at least Jordan's sister was safe from him now. 3 days later at Leonard's office, Coach's lawyers showed up for the settlement conference looking nervous. The mediator was a retired judge who'd handled dozens of educational liability cases, and she made it clear from her opening statements that the evidence against Coach was overwhelming. We spent 6 hours going back and forth about compensation amounts, apology requirements, and policy changes. Coach's lawyer tried to argue for confidentiality agreements, but Leonard shut that down hard, saying part of any settlement required public acknowledgement of what happened so other victims could come forward. By the end of the day, we had an agreement. The district would pay for all my medical expenses, plus damages, implement mandatory athletic abuse training for all coaches, and create an anonymous reporting system for athletes. Coach would be permanently banned from coaching in the state and required to register on a database for child safety. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was something. The next week at my physical therapy appointment, something shifted during the facial exercises. I looked in the mirror and realized the swelling had finally gone down enough that I could recognize myself again. The scars would be permanent and my face would never look exactly like it did before. But I was healing. The therapist saw my expression and smiled, saying visible progress was often the hardest part of recovery because it made you confront what was lost while celebrating what remained. For the first time in months, I felt something like hope instead of just anger and determination. My teammates organized a gathering at Maya's house the following weekend, just the soccer team hanging out without any connection to Coach or the school. They'd made a banner that said, "We see you now," with messages written by everyone about believing me and supporting my recovery. Zoe gave me a photo album filled with pictures from before everything went wrong, reminding me that soccer had once been something I loved instead of something that hurt me. We didn't talk much about the case or Coach, just ate pizza and watched movies and remembered what it felt like to be normal teenagers instead of witnesses in a legal battle. That night, driving home with my mom, she asked if I wanted to try playing soccer again someday, with a different team and a different coach. The question made my chest tight because I honestly didn't know. The sport had been such a huge part of my identity before Coach weaponized it against me. Maybe I could reclaim it eventually, or maybe that chapter of my life was permanently closed by trauma. I told her I needed more time to figure out who I was outside of being Coach Brennan's victim, and she said that was okay, that healing didn't follow any timeline except my own. 6 months after the championship game where everything exploded, the criminal case finally moved forward. The district attorney filed charges for assault and child endangerment based on the medical evidence and witness testimony. Coach pled not guilty and his lawyer mounted an aggressive defense claiming everything was normal athletic training that I'd misinterpreted through emotional instability. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for early fall, giving me the whole summer to prepare for potentially testifying about the worst period of my life in front of strangers. Dr. Clarkson worked with me intensively on managing courtroom anxiety, explaining that the defense would try to rattle me with aggressive questioning designed to make me seem unreliable or vindictive. We practiced staying calm when her assistant played the role of hostile lawyer, learning to take long pauses before answering and stick to factual statements without getting emotional. By the end of summer, I could describe Coach's abuse in clinical detail without my voice shaking, which felt like winning a small battle, even though the real fight was still ahead. Mom started attending a support group for parents of abuse victims, trying to process her guilt about missing the signs. She met other mothers who'd been similarly manipulated by trusted authority figures, learning that predators specifically chose victims whose parents were busy or trusting. The group helped her understand that Coach had deliberately exploited her work schedule and her assumption that coaches had athletes' best interests at heart. Watching her work on forgiving herself made something loosen in my chest, because I'd been carrying guilt too about not speaking up sooner or fighting back harder. We were both learning that abuse survivors and their families carried burdens that didn't belong to them, that the only person truly responsible was Coach himself. The preliminary hearing took place on a humid Friday in September. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with wood paneling and fluorescent lights that buzzed. When they called me to testify, I walked to the witness stand and put my hand on the Bible even though my fingers were shaking. The prosecutor asked me to describe the extra practice sessions, and I told them about staying in goal alone at 5:15 p.m. while Coach fired shots from close range. I explained how he'd make me block head-level kicks until I couldn't see straight, keeping my voice steady even when Coach's lawyer started taking notes aggressively at his table. The prosecutor asked about my injuries, and I listed them chronologically using the medical records as reference. The fractured cheekbone from the championship game, the 3 broken fingers over 18 months, the permanent bruising on my ribs, the concussion symptoms that lasted weeks. Coach's expression stayed neutral, but I saw his jaw tighten when Dr. Halstead took the stand next with his medical evidence. Dr. Halstead pulled up imaging on a screen showing the pattern of healed fractures in my facial bones. He pointed to specific areas where repeated trauma had damaged bone tissue in ways consistent with being struck by soccer balls from extremely close range. His testimony was clinical and unshakable, explaining how the medical evidence proved systematic abuse rather than normal athletic injuries. Coach's lawyer tried to suggest the injuries could have occurred during regular gameplay, but Dr. Halstead calmly explained the physics didn't match. Game injuries came from angles and force levels that produced different fracture patterns than what he'd documented in my case. The judge took extensive notes during medical testimony, her expression growing increasingly disturbed as the evidence accumulated. Maya testified next about what she'd witnessed during practices, describing specific incidents where Coach had verbally berated me while forcing me to continue blocking shots after obvious injuries. She had her journal with her, reading directly from dated entries that documented Coach's behavior with detailed specificity. Jordan and Sienna followed with similar testimony, each adding pieces to the pattern of abuse that became undeniable when presented collectively. Coach's lawyer tried to paint them as teenagers with grudges or unreliable memory, but their consistent details and supporting documentation made that argument fall apart. The judge asked clarifying questions that showed she understood the systematic nature of what had happened, recognizing this wasn't about tough coaching, but deliberate harm. Patricia testified about her investigation, admitting the school district had failed to properly supervise Coach or respond to warning signs. She brought the practice logs showing unauthorized after-hours sessions, the nurses' records documenting escalating injuries, the evidence of previous complaints at other schools that had been ignored during hiring. Her testimony was professionally devastating to the district's narrative that they'd acted reasonably. Coach's lawyer tried to limit her statements about institutional failures, but the judge allowed it all in, saying the pattern of negligent oversight was relevant to understanding how the abuse continued so long. By the time the school principal testified with careful non-answers about administrative protocols, it was clear the institution had prioritized protecting their reputation over protecting their athletes. When Coach finally took the stand in his own defense, his lawyer tried to guide him through safe testimony about his coaching philosophy and dedication to athlete development, but the prosecutor destroyed him on cross-examination, playing audio from the recordings Maya had made where Coach's voice clearly demonstrated anger and contempt rather than constructive instruction. The prosecutor showed Coach his own social media posts about breaking down athletes and asked him to explain what that meant in practical terms. Coach tried to walk back his language, claiming it was metaphorical, but his earlier statements contradicted his testimony. His credibility crumbled as the prosecutor methodically revealed the gap between his public persona as caring mentor and the reality of his systematic abuse. After 3 days of testimony, the judge ruled there was sufficient evidence for the case to proceed to trial. Coach would face charges of third-degree assault and child endangerment, with potential prison time if convicted. His lawyer immediately requested a plea bargain, which the prosecutor said meant they were worried about losing at trial. The DA offered a deal where Coach would plead guilty to reduced charges in exchange for a 3-year suspended sentence, mandatory counseling, and permanent surrender of his teaching and coaching licenses. He'd also have to register as someone who'd committed crimes against children, ensuring no school would hire him again. Coach refused the deal initially, insisting he'd done nothing wrong and that his methods were legitimate if old-fashioned. His lawyer spent a week trying to convince him that going to trial risked much harsher penalties given the strength of the evidence. Finally, Coach agreed to the plea, standing in court and admitting guilt in a voice that sounded forced and rehearsive. The victim impact statements came next, and I'd prepared mine with Dr. Clarkson over many sessions. I stood at the podium and read for 12 minutes about what Coach's abuse had taken from me. The sport I loved, the trust in authority figures, the sense that my body was mine to control. I described the permanent facial scars and ongoing medical treatment, the panic attacks triggered by whistles or loud voices, the therapy needed to separate legitimate coaching from abuse. My voice stayed steady because I'd practiced enough to deliver facts without falling apart, and when I finished, the courtroom was silent except for someone crying in the back row. Mom gave her statement next, describing the guilt of missing the signs and the ongoing impact on our family. Maya, Jordan, and Sienna each spoke briefly about how witnessing my abuse had affected them, creating secondary trauma that they were still processing. The judge listened to everything before delivering her decision, noting that Coach's abuse of trust and authority made his crimes particularly serious despite the plea agreement. She approved the deal, but added additional requirements, including 500 hours of community service and mandatory participation in a program for people who'd harmed children. It wasn't the prison time I'd wanted, but it meant Coach would never hurt another athlete again. The sentencing made local news, and suddenly everyone had opinions about what happened. Some people praised the outcome as appropriate accountability for abusive coaching. Others claimed it was excessive punishment for demanding standards. The comment sections on news articles became war zones where strangers debated whether I was brave or overly sensitive, whether Coach was a predator or a scapegoat for changing attitudes about discipline. Reading the debates made me angry, because they reduced my actual suffering to an abstract discussion about coaching philosophy. But Dr. Clarkson helped me understand that public reaction wasn't about me personally, it was about people's broader anxieties about authority and institutional change. My job was to focus on healing, not winning arguments with strangers online. 3 months after sentencing, I was sitting in my new therapist's office when something shifted during our session. We were processing trauma memories using a technique where you described events while tracking a moving light with your eyes. Usually these sessions left me exhausted and raw, but this time I felt lighter afterward, like some of the emotional weight had finally released its grip. The therapist said trauma processing often happened in unexpected moments, not through dramatic breakthroughs, but through small shifts that accumulated over time. I walked out of her office and realized I'd gone the whole session without crying, which felt like progress, even if it was small. I started volunteering with a youth organization that worked on athletic safety reform, helping develop policies that would protect young athletes from abusive coaches. The work gave me purpose beyond just being Coach's victim, channeling my anger into something constructive. We created educational materials for parents about warning signs of coaching abuse, designed confidential reporting systems that bypassed school administration, and lobbied for legislation requiring background checks that included previous settlements and complaints. Other survivors started reaching out after news coverage of my case, sharing their own stories of coaches who'd used similar tactics. Connecting with people who understood made me feel less isolated, creating a community of survivors who supported each other while working to fix the broken systems that had failed us all. A year after the championship game, my face had healed as much as it was going to without additional plastic surgery. The scars were visible, but not as shocking as they'd been initially, and I'd learned to style my hair in ways that minimized their appearance. More importantly, I'd started to accept them as part of my story instead of something shameful that needed hiding. Dr. Clarkson said visible scars from trauma often became sources of strength once survivors processed what they represented. My face showed evidence of what I'd survived and overcome, proof that Coach hadn't broken me completely no matter how hard he'd tried. Some days I looked in the mirror and felt angry about what he'd taken. Other days I looked in the mirror and felt proud of who I'd become despite him. Mom and I had slowly rebuilt our relationship through family therapy, working through her guilt and my resentment about the 2 years she'd missed what was happening. She'd changed jobs to have more regular hours, ensuring she'd never again be too busy to notice if something was wrong. We developed new routines where we actually talked instead of just coordinating logistics, building trust through small daily interactions. She started attending my advocacy events, not as someone trying to fix her guilt, but as genuine support for work that mattered to me. The healing wasn't linear or complete, but we were learning to be present for each other in ways we hadn't managed before trauma forced us to change. I decided not to play soccer again, accepting that some things couldn't be reclaimed without triggering too much pain. Instead, I found new interests that weren't connected to Coach or that period of my life. I joined the school's newspaper and started writing about institutional accountability and student advocacy. The work felt meaningful in ways sports never quite had, giving me a voice in conversations about how schools could better protect vulnerable students. My articles about athletic abuse reform got picked up by regional publications, and suddenly I was being invited to speak at conferences about youth sports safety. The platform felt strange but important, turning my worst experiences into something that might prevent others from suffering similarly. 2 years after everything changed, I was finishing my college application essays when I realized I'd written about the advocacy work without mentioning Coach at all. My identity had finally expanded beyond being an abuse survivor to include all the other things that made me who I was. The scars were still there, the trauma still influenced how I moved through the world, but they weren't the only defining features anymore. I'd built something bigger than what he'd tried to destroy, creating meaning from suffering in ways that felt genuine rather than forced. Dr. Clarkson said this was what healthy recovery looked like, not forgetting or completely healing, but integrating trauma into a larger life story that included growth and purpose alongside pain. I got accepted to 3 universities and chose one with a strong sports management program where I could study policy reform and institutional accountability. The decision felt right, using my experiences to understand the systems that had failed me while working to rebuild them better. Mom helped me move into the dorms, and as we unpacked boxes in my new room, she said she was proud of who I'd become. Not despite what happened, but including it as part of my story. That distinction mattered, acknowledging that trauma had changed me without letting it define me completely. I hung a photo of my old soccer team on the wall, not to remember the abuse, but to honor the teammates who'd stood with me when it mattered. Their courage had made justice possible, proving that speaking up was worth the risk even when the outcome wasn't certain. Looking at that photo, I knew I'd survived something that should have destroyed me, and instead of breaking, I'd found strength I hadn't known existed. Coach had tried to make me smaller, but I'd become larger than his cruelty, building a life where his voice no longer controlled the narrative about who I was allowed to be. Thanks for hanging out till the end. If you want more stories, make sure to subscribe and leave your take below.